Good afternoon and welcome to the release of the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies 2015 Housing Report, State of the Nation's Housing Report. We're here at the Ford Foundation. I am Jim Zarroli from NPR, and I am joined by the Joint Center's Managing Director, Chris Herbert, along with Paul Weech, the President and CEO of NeighborWorks America. Celia Smoot is the Director of Housing for the Local Initiative Support Corporation. Next to her is Lynn Fisher, Vice President of Research and Economics at the Mortgage Bankers Association. And finally, Don Chen, who is Director of Metropolitan Opportunity here at the Ford Foundation in New York. If you're watching online, you can tweet your questions to our panel using the hashtag Harvard Housing Report, and we'll take some of those questions in a bit. This report is really sort of a tale of two markets. The home ownership market has recovered quite a bit in the past 5 years or so, but the rebound has been less vigorous than we would expect given the improvement in the economy. At the same time, the market for rental housing is booming right now. The nation's vacancy rate is low. So we want to talk about some of the forces behind that. Chris Herbert, let's start with home ownership. About 650,000 single-family homes were started last year, which is a really significant increase from the depths of the recession. But it is still surprisingly low by historical standards. What are some of the reasons that we continue to see a lag in single-family home construction, even though prices are going up?
That's a great question. You know, I think we often lose sight of the fact when we look at statistics about the housing market and the state of the housing market, and we look at the latest increase and we say, oh, you know, housing starts, housing construction is up, and lose that longer perspective. And so when we do look at this longer perspective, where we are now with single-family housing starts at 650,000, this would have been the worst year for single-family construction in the last half century before this downturn. So we really are at very anemic levels. I do think it's important, though, before we even talk about the homeownership side, is just to look at overall construction levels. And so this past year, we just got back to 1 million housing units built overall, which itself is also a really low figure, even given the strength of the rental market. So I think the first thing we have to look at is why is that overall level of construction so low? And it goes back to the question of household formation. How much are we adding households? And at this point, you know, when you look at what the primary driver of household growth is the adult population. And we haven't had any significant fall off in adult population through the downturn. What has happened is we've seen a lot less household formation, particularly among young adults. And so that's really pulling down the rate of household growth and pulling down the overall level of construction that we're seeing. So on the one hand, we're seeing multifamily starts that are at historic highs relative to where we've been over the last 2 decades. But overall housing demand has been so low because of the fact that household formation has been low. But there's a whole other set of reasons why it is that we're not buying homes and why it is we're choosing to rent. Mm-hmm. What are some of the other reasons? Well, you know, I think a key reason is there's supply and demand factors. And on the demand side, I think that, you know, we've seen household incomes have really been falling sharply through the recession. Median household income is now back to where it was in 1995. And so I think we're really seeing, in some sense, that we haven't had that buying power. And then on the supply side, I think that, you know, we really do have to look at the questions of what's happening in the mortgage market and then access to credit. And while there certainly was needs to tighten up credit and under what terms mortgages are made available, I think there's a variety of measures. The Urban Institute, CoreLogic, the Mortgage Bankers Association have all come up with measures to assess where are we now in terms of ability to get a mortgage relative not to the peak, but to where we were a decade ago. And by all those measures, we're seeing that it's much harder to get a mortgage. So you factor in we both have weakness on the demand side and also challenges on the supply side in getting a mortgage. I think that's partly what's pulling down home ownership. Mm-hmm.
Paul Weech, people still say they want to buy, and mortgage rates are still relatively low. Homes are more affordable than they were before the recession. So why do you think it is that people aren't trying to buy?
Well, Chris just touched upon some of the things I had on my mind, Jim, but I'd be remiss if I didn't start by thanking the Ford Foundation for hosting this event today and for praising the Joint Center for Housing Studies for this report. It's a service to America. It's great analysis and data that we housers really rely on. So I just want to honor Chris and his team for doing that. So I think my answer to your question, Jim, is that there's obviously a variety of factors, and I said Chris talked on a couple of them. And what's more interesting to me as I kind of go through the different factors that come out to mind is which one of these are cyclical and which ones are structural, because that'll tell us 5 years from now, 10 years from now, where we'll be on home ownership again. And so the first one I think is somewhat cyclical. We're suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome here as a result of the foreclosure crisis. Prior to the crisis, everybody expected housing prices to rise. You can invest in a home and buy a home and make money. It was a good investment. And it turns out that that's not true. And so people are very, very cautious about going back into the market, I believe, with that in their recent memory. And this PTSD also affects the lending industry, right? So banks lost a lot of money, and their risk officers were embarrassed throughout the crisis. And so the banks are in the mortgage market in what I think is a historically cautious way as a result of the recent experience. To be sure, though, there are also structural changes in the market. At least I believe they're structural. There have been major changes in the rules governing lending and servicing. And this is going to change the way that people access credit going forward. I think these are structural, and it concerns me about what it means for access to credit going forward. And then getting one more level of post-traumatic stress is there are an awful lot of consumers who could be part of our demand equation out there who've been damaged by the foreclosure crisis. Their credit has been battered from prolonged delinquencies or from a foreclosure. Their houses are worth less than they owe on those houses. Those are an awful lot of people that normally might be circulating the market, buying homes, accessing credit, and creating more market demand. In the report, I thought they did a terrific job of also focusing in on the typical first-time home buyer, the young person who might be out there to buy your first home. And they're under particular different kinds of financial stress right now. Their incomes are lower on average than in the past. Many of them, their student debt is a lot higher than it's ever been in the past and more pronounced on their household balance sheet. And they too are a little bit more cautious about getting to the market. I'm reflecting now on the final issue that I should mention that kind of came out of the report that I think is interesting to pose, and that is whether there's been a structural change in consumer preferences for buying homes, amongst these young people. I mean, I've seen it as I've traveled the country in my new job here at NeighborWorks. In Washington, D.C., where I live, I've been to Raleigh, North Carolina, I've been to Denver, Colorado, and I've been to Midtown Detroit, where the pressures on rents are incredible as young people are moving back into the cities, and this preference for renting and that urban lifestyle seems very pronounced in those places. I think we all have to just wait and see how that plays out and whether those young people, when they get married, move to the suburbs where they can have a backyard for their kids and better schools. And so it may, in my mind, I look at the survey that you referenced in your question, Jimmy, the surveys show people do think they want to own a home over their lifetime. And I think it's probably the new trends into the urban areas are just a pause or a postponement of the day when they will go out and buy homes.
Celia Smoot, there's been a big decline in the sale of the forced sale of distressed properties, which is a good thing. But 15%, according to the report, 15% of homeowners still have less than 20% equity in their homes. So there is a hangover from the Great Recession still. Can you talk about some of the problems this creates in individual neighborhoods and also just in the housing market as a whole?
So one of the things that immediately strike me around that particular number is that we look at overall values in the market as we come out of the crisis. And then there's definitely, as you look at certain neighborhoods in certain markets, there's definitely an inequality about how values have returned or not returned in neighborhoods. So what you see playing out is in some places where the values have returned, those are in areas what we would call more like hot markets or markets that are tipping, because you can still have a weak market. There's, you would never say particularly that Detroit is a hot market, but there's definitely neighborhoods within Detroit that are more tipping to more of a hot market area, some parts of the urban core. And so this inequality in values is more pronounced in largely minority neighborhoods. You're going to see this value issue more pronounced in areas where you have high rates of foreclosures and vacancies, and then what you also have is issues with owner-occupied housing. And so that plays out in the neighborhood in a way, especially around values, where you see there's not a return to this housing wealth that for most, especially for low African American Latino families, that is where their wealth was. Their wealth was in the house that they own. And I know that Don and I have talked a lot about that, and he's going to add some as well. But I wanted to kind of talk about, anecdotally how that plays out. So, for example, there was a report that came out. It was an article a couple of months ago about Prince George's County. Prince George's County just have a predominantly African American neighborhood, and what you will find is a lot of those are African Americans who work in DC, work in the federal government, and during the housing boom, they built houses. Was a lot of housing built, single family housing built in that market. Crash happens, and you see the market returning, and I'm putting that in quotation marks. You see the market returning, but it's not really returning in that particular county. So what's so different? What's so different from that county? And you can go 2 miles, and then you're in parts of what was really a rougher, low-income neighborhood in DC, and now it's completely gentrified. So what's changed? And I think some of it has to do with some of the kind of market inequalities that we're seeing in neighborhoods.
Just to add to that a little bit, the report talks about the fact that the share of households that are underwater has come down a lot, but the places where it's concentrated are minority and low-income communities. It's also a difference between high end and low end of the market. So the larger mortgage, balanced mortgages are much less likely to be underwater than small balanced mortgages. And that, I think that's really blocking the first-time buyer market. So that entry-level market is still facing much more headwind from recovery from the housing crisis, which is holding back that first-time buyer market, the entry buyer, and that's kind of a whole change of activity that has to happen in the market. So the fact that the market is healing differentially, both in terms of communities of color and low-income communities, and also at different price points, is having an effect on the broader market.
Don Chen, do you want to talk about that? I mean, housing is the way people build wealth. So what do these problems that Celia is talking about, what does that mean for, especially for low-income people, but for minorities, for people of color?
Sure. Well, I think one thing that we've seen from the post-recession years is that the racial wealth gap in particular among African Americans, Latinos, between them and whites, has accentuated a huge amount. It's gone up quite a bit. And it's not just a temporary thing. It seems like it's going to be a generational impact. And this is one of the things that we really get to dig into in this report. One of the challenging things is it's not just the tremendous loss of wealth as a result of homes being more likely to be underwater, more likely to be in that 10% of really distressed neighborhoods. It's also what we're seeing is that the recovery in terms of the people's proportional wealth. African Americans, Latinos tend to have most of their wealth, as Celia mentioned, in their home. White households tend to have a more diversified portfolio of wealth. And so as the recovery occurs, we see the stock market rebounding a little bit. The white households are doing much better, relatively speaking. Black and Latino households are trailing far behind. And I think that what this tells us is that there are a number of implications for that. Being able to really target the band of potential prospective homeowners that really are not able to get a mortgage because of these tightened requirements is a real key strategy that I know we're going to talk about some more as well. And then also really targeting revitalization efforts in these distressed communities where the recovery has not occurred. I like this theme of a tale of two markets. What we're really also seeing is a tale of two cities, geographically and spatially, and then also a tale of two recoveries if we look at it from a demographic standpoint.
Could I add a macro
Sure.
point to that?
Sure.
We've been looking at the Federal Reserve's household balance sheet recently, and it is really interesting to see that homeowners' equity in their homes has recovered to the percentage of home value that it was back in 2008. So I mean, we've actually had that recovery, at least in aggregate. How it plays out is quite disparate. And the other fact that was in there was, homeowner equity is now about $11 trillion, a little over $11 trillion. Households hold about $10 trillion in bank deposits. And so, to the point that this is such an important piece of wealth for most homeowners, we've recovered back. answer
Lynn
that.
Fisher, Paul, we talked about this a little bit, that people are a little bit maybe gun shy about getting back into the housing market, but so are bankers. The housing collapse happened in part because more lending standards were loosened, and after that, regulators have taken a lot of steps to tighten lending standards. But do these continuing problems in the housing sector suggest maybe we went a little bit too far?
I think to give a balanced answer, I'd have to start where Chris did and say, you know, they're both demand. Do people want and can people afford mortgages right now? And if they want one, can they get one? I think there's two sides to this story. And I think that no one would want to go back to the type of lending environment we had that led to the housing crisis. But I think it's also a pretty fair statement to say the pendulum's probably swung a little bit too far in the other direction and has tightened up credit to the point that it is having an impact on the market. So I think both of these forces are at play. We have a mortgage credit availability index. Chris alluded to that a little bit ago. And if you look at the current level of that index, it's measuring the supply of mortgages that are available to the market, but not only just the amount, the types, the variety of loans that are out there, the types of terms that are available. And it's nowhere near the level it was in 2004. And I don't know what the exact right level is, but it's an order of magnitude different than what we saw prior to the crisis. So I think it's certainly an important factor in what's going on in the housing market. You know, a lot of people will talk about needing money to have a down payment. A lot of people have talked about the need to have very high credit scores. I think the lenders are looking at some other things that are perhaps constraining credit. You know, the amount of verification of income that has to happen, the amount of documentation is enormous, and the documentation has to be perfect. It can't be, you know, good enough. It has to be perfect now. And so it's onerous both for the lender and for the borrower. In addition, lenders are really trying to figure out what the rules of the game are. There is a real desire for clarity about the rules, about, you know, the liability that they're going to take on when they originate a loan. There's a lot of things that they can have liability for that may not have a lot to do with about the creditworthiness of the borrower at hand, and they very much would like clarity about the rules and how they're going to be enforced. And I think that would help a lot, and we're certainly working with a variety of partners to try to do that. And then there's sort of the law of unintended consequences. There's a lot of rules that have been put in place, some of which have probably impacted different parts of the market differently. So for example, to originate a qualified mortgage, which gives lenders a little bit of protection from liability, there's a cap on points and fees that can be charged that's 3% of loan value. Well, that means that for some smaller loan balances, and we know that smaller loans haven't been getting originated, that could be a constraint to credit. So I think there's lots of different things going on, and some of them not quite as visible as others.
Can I add to that, Jim? I think that this is a really serious issue, and I think one way to begin to address it is to look at the supply, which is largely what you've described, and also look at the demand. There's a lot of set of things that we can really look at on the supply side. On the demand side, going back to what Paul said, it is a challenge for us to figure out what's cyclical and what's structural, and I think the report really sheds some light on that. One of the exciting things is that we see potential growth in homeownership and participation in the sector from immigrants. And so to me, that seems like an opportunity for really targeting and working with different communities to try to generate more interest in that area. The other thing that I've seen recently is a potential generational shift away from home ownership for a variety of reasons. Maybe, as you were saying, Paul, some people are damaged not only in terms of their credit, but also in terms of their perception of what the American dream is. And some are really starting to think about retirement savings as opposed to home ownership as a vehicle for wealth generation. And so that's a serious set of things as well. And we're going to have to really sort through a lot of those causes as we go forward.
We have a question from Twitter. The question is, the report says minorities are expected to make up the majority of future household growth. So what does this mean long-term for the future of housing and home ownership? Will home ownership rates keep going down? That's a good question. Anybody want to talk about that?
Well, I'll start. I mean, I think we do have historically wide gaps in homeownership rates between minorities and whites, so something on the order of 25, 26 percentage points, and so it's quite substantial. It's interesting, if you do look at the stated desire to own a home, there really is very little difference in terms of racial groups, in terms of saying how much they wish to own. So it's not so much differences in will, it's difference in way of being able to achieve that. So I think if you project out where we are today and say that those disparities are going to persist, you will see that we're going to have a downward pressure on homeownership rates overall. I think the question is, do we have the will as a country to kind of think about a pathway to homeownership for people who want it and who can succeed at it? So I wouldn't take that as necessarily a given to say that the homeownership rate has to go down. I think what we want to do is see if there are ways to make sure that people who can buy have an opportunity to do it when it's within their means.
Yeah, Jim, I would just add to that, so we at NeighborWorks have set rebuilding the path to low income and minority home ownership as a priority. And it's going to take new kinds of interventions, new kinds of products. We have a lot of the tools through the home buyer education programs, new models of financial coaching and counseling, nonprofit as lenders that can underwrite in a different way and attract that market in a better way. So I'm with Chris. I don't think we should look at projections just based on the current gaps in home ownership rates to project that we'll have lower home ownership rates in the future. In fact, we should have very conscious strategies to upend that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think it's also a little bit misguided to say to just anchor on 2014 or 2015, because we're at historic lows in homeownership rates right now, and there will be some economic forces that will naturally provide a rebound. Income is improving, job market is improving, as we speak. A lot of job openings right now, and so I think income will improve somewhat and help. But the other thing, more to the original question, we will have a more diverse population, but that millennial population is aging right into that 30 to 40-year-old bucket where they are more likely to be homeowners. So while there is a difference in race and ethnic homeownership rates across different groups, they're all aging. And so there's a partial offset, I think, in some of those behavioral factors.
And I'll just add that this is another opportunity/challenge for us, because Chris is absolutely right about the way things are looking in terms of the next generation. One of the challenges is that there is a perception that African Americans and Latinos really don't have as good a proposition in terms of home ownership. For example, for every dollar of wealth that a white household gains, African American households only gain 75 cents on that dollar because their properties accrue at a slower rate. For Latinos families, I believe it's 70 cents on the dollar for white households. And so the perception of how good a deal this is in terms of how they should invest their money over the long term needs to be addressed, and I think it's another opportunity for us.
So we've been talking a lot about problems in the housing market and the fact that it still faces challenges, but the rental market is very strong, as the report points out. 2014 was the 10th consecutive year of robust growth in the number of rental households. The national rental vacancy rate is at its lowest level in 2 decades. Chris Herbert, who are all these people who are now flooding into the rental market, and what are they renting?
I think the answer is it's everybody, and they're renting everything. Is the short answer. So, if the numbers are kind of staggering. We went back and looked at different 10-year periods and the average annual growth in renter households. And so if you go back to, say, the 1970s, which is when the baby boom generation was really starting to come out and live on its own, and really was a big decade for rental housing. In the 70s, we averaged about 500,000 new renters a year. Over the last 10 years, we've averaged 770,000. And over the last 4 years, we've averaged over 900,000. And this last year, based on the best data we have available, it's somewhere north of 1 million. So that expansion of the rental market is really phenomenal, is the short answer. Who it is it really reflects the fact that the home ownership rates have fallen off substantially pretty much across the board, except for among the oldest households. So we're seeing it's more young people renting. We've talked a lot about the millennials. Millennials are now solidly in their 20s, a period of time when people tend to rent, and that certainly boosted the rental market. And I think we hear about all this hot rental market, we keep picturing 20-somethings in Brooklyn. Well, the 20-somethings are certainly out there, but it's also a lot of people in 30s and 40s and 50s who were formerly homeowners. And it's a lot more families with kids, too, who are formerly homeowners. So if we look at the age distribution, in fact, the biggest group are people, our oldest age group, who are growing fastest as renters. And that's really reflecting the fact that we are an aging society as well. So, you said, what are they renting? And so because of the fact there's a diverse group of households, we're seeing a diversity in terms of the type of housing that's being brought into the rental market. And part of it also represents an opportunistic movement of the fact that we built a lot of single-family homes over the last decade, and with a lot of those homeowners no longer in those homes, a lot of that housing is converted over to rental. So the figure that's now being shown shows by decade, we've added so many rental occupied housing units, were they multifamily or single-family. And the dark portions show you the single-family share. And what we see is over the last 10 years, and certainly the last 5 years, a majority of what we added has been single-family housing that's been added to the rental stock. And that's reflecting the fact that we have this diverse set of households who are looking to rent, not just, we conflate renting with multifamily and owning with single-family. It's never been true, but it's less true now than it was in the past as well. So we've seen a lot of single-family housing, and in the last few years we've seen a tremendous increase in multifamily construction. The report points out that last year we started more multifamily housing than we had at any year since the late 1980s, and much more of that is for rental housing. So the good news is that given we have all this demand, we are seeing a really strong supply response, but as you noted, with vacancy rates down, the supply response hasn't been sufficient to keep up with that demand, keeping upward pressure on rents. And so a real challenge for us in the country is, can we keep adding multifamily housing and other types of housing for renters and across a broad rent spectrum? A lot of what we've been adding has been more at the high end and not enough at the moderate income and certainly at the low income level. So
what does that mean for rents? I know in New York City it is really, really difficult right now to find a place to rent an apartment. Anybody want to?
It means that households are incredibly cost burdened. There's a great report that comes out every year by the National Low Income Housing Coalition called Out of Reach, and they estimate the amount that people have to earn if they're just working a regular job in order to afford a modest two-bedroom apartment, and I think it's close to $19 or $20 an hour at this point, and that's a really serious concern. And the Harvard study really has established these benchmarks over time to understand how cost-burdened households are. I think what it means is also that in cities like New York, San Francisco, and others, there's a real perception and a real fact of displacement and gentrification, people getting squeezed out of places. And there has been a really interesting debate online, on Slate, on other publications saying gentrification is a myth. I think a lot of the people who are getting squeezed out of these markets would beg to differ. It's much more complicated than these relatively straightforward simple analyses of what's going on. And I think as a result, you see cities, especially the hot ones like New York City, where the hot housing market is dominating, you see cities really scrambling to try to come up with solutions. And they have a very heroic and admirable housing plan, and a lot of other cities do. A lot of the tools that are available are inclusionary housing and trying to get the private sector to participate in that. But the fact is, you can't really do this without capital. You can't do it without public investment, private capital, and the mechanisms for really investing a lot more in affordable housing are just not there like they used to be. And I think that's a role for federal and state governments as well.
Celia Smith?
Yeah, so one of the things we particularly look at, especially as we look in some of our hot markets, and I always want to say hot neighborhoods, because you can have a weak market that has certain hot neighborhoods. And what we're finding is that we generally are looking at housing, and we have a tendency sometimes in our industry to kind of focus on affordable housing as a kind of a monolith. It's like, it's just, okay, we need to figure out affordable housing, and we kind of pick one demographic, one particular type of AMI, and we focus on that. But really, if you look at the need for housing, especially you talk about rent burden, it really is a horizon. And I kind of feel like the private high market stuff that's coming online now, that's going to take care of itself. What we have is a real disparity about what we do around this middle income band, because there's not really a true programming, there's not true funding to really figure out how you build and create that type of affordable middle income band. And then you have basically federal programming, federal funding that kind of supports the lower AMI, but that's decreasing every year. So what you end up is this huge disparity around just rental housing, and what you have a lot of this, and then everyone else in that other band basically has a really high increase in their rent burden. And that goes to all the other things we've talked about: income disparity between minority households and white households, the millennials, and the fact that they're coming into the marketplace with much lower incomes, and thus they're more in that middle income band, but their housing burden is just pretty, it's tough.
Yeah, so I actually like to jump in there, Jim. I'm back on my structural cyclical kick, right? And it feels to me, just as Cecilia said, that the robust growth in the multifamily market is building to the increased demand for units with amenities and fitness centers and that sort of thing. But it's not building to the needs of low income and very low income households. And what hits me about all this is that this is a structural problem. We have had an affordable rental housing crisis in this country for years, right? And what's noteworthy about, and the State of the Nation's Housing Report has been reporting year after year how high the rent burdens are in America, especially for low-income people. What's noteworthy about this report is how much it's grown over the last couple of years and how much worse the problem has gotten.
Lynn Fisher, this might seem like an obvious question, but if you look in different sectors of the economy, like retail, for instance, retail has a high end and a low end. It doesn't seem to be the same in the housing sector. It seems, certainly here in New York, lots of very high-end buildings are going up everywhere you look. But why don't developers step in and build more moderate income or even low-income housing?
I think you need to start with the economics of this, which in economics we would use the word filtering. That typically what happens is housing is you build Class A, high end, with the best of everything housing, and over time that housing ages and it becomes available at different rent levels and different price levels, and that tends to circulate through the community in that way, and then we see revivals where people will redevelop that housing, gentrify it. It might be brought back up to a new price point. But typically, if you're a developer, you're going to maximize the value of your site, and that is going to be building to the highest value that you can attain. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not sites for which, Class B, if I use an office term, housing wouldn't be the right type of stuff to build to a lower income point. And so that there could be different locations where it might be viable from a market point of view, but maybe where zoning or other local regulatory restrictions might not allow for the housing to be built that you want. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is there's a break point. Housing is big, it's bulky. There's only so far down the income spectrum that you can build new product that will be supported by the rents or the price that are going to be paid in the other end. And so at some point it becomes an income problem as much as it is a housing problem. And you have to put those two pieces together.
In fact, Jim, that's the way I was going to say it, is that the cost of land, the cost of construction, the cost of operating a building leads to a certain rent level, and in many, many markets, that rent level isn't affordable to low-income people. In fact, the way I always say it, and you can think about the next level of person, the extremely low-income person, if we could build or provide housing at no cost, very low-income people can't even afford to pay the operating cost of that unit at an affordable part of their income. And so that's really the structural mismatch in our society.
We have a question from Twitter which kind of goes to what we were talking about before about gentrifying neighborhoods. What have hot market neighborhoods done to achieve that status that other neighborhoods can take as an example? Are there things that some neighborhoods
that status meaning their hotness?
Yeah, how does a neighborhood become hot? Is there something it can do? I don't know.
What made them become hot?
I mean, I wonder about that. Why is Bed-Stuy a hot neighborhood now and Sunnyside, Queens is not? I mean, why do,
One factor is often access and transportation access. And so if you're a place, if you put in a new subway line, you're going to gentrify the area that subway line goes to. Part of it can be that we had areas that have been accessible, but for other reasons, their history, Bed-Stuy's history, and so it had become a place that was impoverished and safety was an issue. Then you have some people who enter into that market who start to change the dynamic a little bit and suddenly realize Bed-Stuy is pretty close. And so, we can actually live there and get to Manhattan. And so that access issue starts to become one that you can take advantage of. So I think, I always think about it in terms of places that are going to gentrify are places that have access to employment centers. And if they're low income now, they're probably at risk if there's a change in that dynamic. We always think of like artists and others that kind of go in and pioneer that change. But the other thing is that any kind of major transit improvements will do that. In Boston, there's going to be an extension of the Green Line through a part of Somerville that has not been gentrified, and Somerville's trying to get out in front of that by creating a master plan for that area to say, okay, we know that this place is going to gentrify as soon as this Green Line comes in. What can we do to try to get out in front of it? And it's not easy.
Did you want to add?
I would just say that there's numerous stories across the list footprint that tells that particular story. There have been neighborhoods that we've been working in for 20 years, and we kind of look up 20 years later. It's like, well, we did a lot of community development in this neighborhood, and wow, the neighborhood started not to look like didn't look anything like it did 20 years ago. In some ways, to respect it means that everyone in the marketplace did a really good job. But I think the final part is really said we did a good job as a housing industry is if we did the good job and we made sure that we had intentionality about creating long-term affordability in the neighborhood, right? So we want to create communities of choice, communities where people want to live, but as these neighborhoods are changing and they are becoming more gentrifying, we as an industry, we only really have done our jobs really well if we make sure that there is clearly affordability that's maintained as the neighborhoods gentrify. For another prime example, which is in DC, which is Columbia Heights, right? So you have new metro station that popped up, and then all of a sudden, literally half that community has been priced out of that community. And it's just one little extension on the metro line. And now you went from having a neighborhood where there was a lot of CDC activity, ideas about trying to address owner-occupied housing, dealing with some blight and vacancy, and now what you have is a Whole Foods. And so, it's completely changed that housing market.
Yeah, it has. And this is a really important point because if you think about the way cities operate, it's really, in a lot of cities, I would say the vast majority of cities, it's really low-income people on balance who take public transportation. And so you could have a situation if you don't do that equitable TOD, transit-oriented development with affordable housing and permanent long-term affordability, then you run the risk of having transit-dependent people not being able to access public transportation. They don't live close enough to it. They can't get to their destinations, and that's been a focus of a lot of us in the philanthropic sector to try to make sure that those connections are made. The flip side to all this, to what Chris was saying, is that, Jim, you asked earlier about what do people do if they're very low income? What are their options? Is there a supply of really low-cost housing? A lot of that low-cost housing means driving 90 minutes for your commute every day from a really distant location because the housing is a lot less costly, and then therefore you generate a ton of traffic, and that's how you make up the cost in terms of your housing cost. Yeah.
One more example,
Sure.
I just sort of,
Sure.
In addition to transit investment, sometimes it's the investment in a new employer, and what's coming to mind now is the city of Detroit. It's actually a constellation of things, but in Detroit, a lot of that revitalization started when Quicken Loans decided to move its entire workforce downtown. And its workforce tends to trend young, and so it was instant kind of gentrification, and around that grew up the bars and the restaurants and the nightlife that population tends to want. But a bunch of other things happened too. They got a new mayor and a new confidence in the city government. They got a lot of work to do, but a new confidence in the city government. There's a bunch of other kinds of investments coming in, like a light rail system, like new stadiums, new money coming in. Overlooked that struck me about what allowed this all to happen was that some of the anchor institutions, including Quicken Loans and Wayne State University, supplemented the local police force. That they provided the security, Wayne State provided the security for all of Midtown, and Dan Gilbert provided additional security for the spaces around his buildings downtown, which made it that much easier for people to live there.
Celia Smoot, I wanted to just ask you, sort of move into the area of affordable housing again. A lot of the affordable housing that exists today was built with programs like the low-income housing tax credit, which were meant to be temporary. So what happens when those programs expire, and how much is that going to aggravate the problems that we're seeing?
So I think there's going to be a slide, but what we're seeing overall is that these programmings, and it's intentional if you think about it, because what it was meant to do was to kind of create this marriage between the public and private industry, have the banks through getting the credits, put equity into low-income neighborhoods, which is great, and to build low-income housing for. And I want to point out something about the tax credit program. It actually gets to not extremely low income. It really does address more of your 50 and your 60% AMI. It doesn't touch 30% AMI. That's where the other housing programs like the project-based rental census programs, HUD, USDA, those generally are touching the lower income bands. But as we're seeing, it's like over the years, as these projects that were built, some 30 and 40 years ago, a lot of the tax credit projects that are built that are coming out of that kind of first 15-year compliance period, we're seeing a trending of a loss of affordable housing. There was literally a study that was done that said that for every 2 units of affordable housing that we do put online, we lose 1. And so it becomes especially acute in some of our hot markets where, just quite frankly, if you could get out of these kind of regulatory environment from the project-based rental assistance or the low-income housing tax credit program, you can just switch to a market rate project. You also
does that tend to happen? Do these properties usually become market rate?
Yeah. So what we are finding in those markets, literally, I mean, I remember working in DC and working on several projects when that literally was happening. Like, you were getting to the place where they were able to opt out of kind of Section 8 rental sets, this kind of HUD regulatory environment, and the projects were going market. So that happens in these harder markets because just the rent levels that you can charge now for these neighborhoods that are changing, that have gentrified. You don't need the idea of you have this rental assistance to kind of keep the project afloat when the market itself will take care of it. And I always have this commentary. The market is not equitable on its own. It isn't, right? So these programs were supposed to create this more equality in the market. But what we're finding, even for some of the tax credit projects, you have this initial 15-year compliance period, and most of them after 1994 had this additional 15 years, this kind of extended use agreement after the 15-year compliance period. But we're seeing, even that particular case, after the first 15 years, the projects are then still creeping above maximum LIHTC rents, even though those are supposed to be the affordable units. Even those rent burdens are going up higher, even throughout this kind of extended use agreement. Some of it coming from the fact that the regulators are just overburdened, and so they can't pay attention to that longer extended use period. They're kind of focusing really on the first 15 years. So it means that you have a lot of housing that really is intended for low-income people that's not so much there anymore. And then the costs, housing costs or building costs are really expensive. So that really puts us back into this idea that we need to preserve what we have.
One of the things the report says is the growing need for housing aid continues to overwhelm the capacity of federal, state, and local government. I know here in New York City, the city is making a real effort to build affordable housing and has for a long time. It's not keeping pace with the demand.
No, it's not. And think about a market like New York that has such high rents. But the same thing is true in lower, not so hot markets. We have even cities that have declining populations, like a lot of the legacy cities, a lot of the Rust Belt, Midwest cities. Even there, for the housing that's remained, it's either not in the best shape, it's very distressed. We have a lot of this idea of this distressed owner-occupied housing. And then you also have, for the rental market that's there, it's actually truly not affordable for the income levels that are there. So their rent burden, even in these weaker legacy city markets. And so you find the programming from federal and local cities and states are trying to focus on how do we create a marketplace that allows for the development of affordable housing, and really trying to leverage what they have and try to bring the private market involved. If you think about some of the program that's happened here in New York, some of the program that's definitely happened in San Francisco, and I wanted to kind of tie one particular thing in there, which we've kind of talked a lot about affordable housing. We've talked about this rental and home ownership market, but there's one particular type of housing that was created really to address this low income band, and that's public housing, and you see that as a huge burden in the marketplace. $25 billion based on certain estimates of deferred capital needs. So you have, and so what we're losing is housing that's being lost to obsolescence and just conversion to market. And so the programming that cities are trying to do is how do we raise funding to kind of address and build this rental housing. City of Austin, San Francisco, they've done these general obligation bonds, and for cities to do general ob bonds, really focus really purely, we're going to use that funding to build and preserve housing.
Jim, just a couple of quick observations too about the pressures on these programs. So one thing to bear in mind is that programs like the Housing Choice Voucher Program that pays the difference between a household's income and 30% of their income in rents. With incomes falling and rents rising, the amount of subsidy that has to go to each person is going up. So even if we're devoting more money to that, how many people we can help is being strained by the general dynamic in the market. Another factor I think is important is thinking about, we talked about the low-income housing tax credit. It has two uses. One use is to build new housing, expand the supply of housing we've had, but it's also used to a great degree by injecting capital into existing, and preserving existing stock. And so as much as this need to preserve has been rising, the low-income housing tax credit program is getting pulled in both of those directions. So I think there's a variety of reasons why there are pressures on these programs. And then I guess the backdrop of that is the fact that with the recession, the number of people who qualify for housing has been rising and rising. It's starting to level off a little bit as we're seeing incomes plateau or start to turn. But in a sense, that need is growing against this background of strained resources. And the other piece of the puzzle, too, is the HOME program, which is a block grant program through HUD that provides critical gap financing that closes the gap between what the tax credit can provide, say, and what's needed to make units affordable. And that program's been subject to federal cutbacks as part of sequestration and the like. That's really reduced it. So lots of different fronts are nibbling away at what we can do in a situation where already we only help 1 out of 4 people who are eligible for this assistance.
Okay. We don't have a lot more time, but I want to give the audience a chance. If you'd like to ask a question, please just raise your hand. In the meantime, I wanted to ask Lynn Fisher, one of the things that came out of the report, which struck me, was the millennial generation is huge. I'm used to thinking of the baby boomers as the dominant generation in everything. But the millennial generation is huge, and they are now at the point where they are moving into buying houses, or they should be. So what does that actually mean for the housing market today, and what's the potential impact 10 years from now?
Well, I think the impact today is somewhat obvious by what Chris was talking about earlier. We have, and there was a great graphic in the report on this, where we look at the number of millennials that are out there in terms of population, and they have been very, very slow, and the graphic is up now, populations on the left. The number of households in the same age groups and the same cohorts are on the right. Millennials have been really slow to form new households, right? They haven't had the money. They came out, got their first job if they could find one, and money's been tight.
Still living in their parents'
So they're still living in their parents' home. They're doubling up. But what we've seen in the very end of 2014, and I think, again, the report alludes to this, household formation started picking up. And just at the time that we know real wage growth has in fact begun and more jobs are available. So we're seeing the simultaneity of household formation. And so what that big millennial population means is that there are a lot of households that are going to come. Right now, they're overwhelmingly becoming renters because they're getting that first job, they're getting settled, they're moving out of their parents' homes. And so we're seeing, there's more multifamily housing under construction right now than at any time since the mid-1970s, but for a couple months in the 80s. So I know people are somehow dissatisfied with the amount that we're producing, but it is record levels of multifamily housing that's being produced right now. And that's sort of the short-term impact. Everybody's looking at them as renters. I think the long-term picture is really interesting because we don't know, right? Everybody tries to get inside the millennials' heads. We're not exactly sure where they're gonna go. A colleague of mine is fond of saying 35's the new 25, right? Millennials have more education, They're putting off families later, especially the women are much more highly educated than they were even 20 years ago. And they're putting off families till later. So that home buying age is creeping up, but there's still the sense that they want to become home buyers in and around that 35, 40-year-old age. So my numbers are a little bit more maybe optimistic on how many households there are going to be. I think there's going to be about 5 million new households over the next 10 years that are age 45 and under. And of those, it really, who's going to be homeowners and who's going to be renters, I think is still something to be figured out. If it stays at 2014 homeownership rates, right, and we look at this by age and race and specific groups, if we just play that out with that 5 million new households, it could be a 50-50 split, owners and renters. If we revert to something more like a long-term average, not as high as we were in terms of homeownership rates in 2005, but something more like a long-term average, right? We need the economy to support it. We need the mortgage market to be able to support those things. But if that would happen, then we could be looking at 4 million new millennial homeowners and 1 million renters. Either way, there's a lot of housing demand coming from the sector. No matter which way they go, we need housing.
Jim, I just want to throw in a plug for the baby bust or the echo boom generation, Gen X, for Lynn. There's a lot of talk now about the baby boom, the age of the baby boom, the impact they're going to have on the housing market, and a lot of talk for good reason about the millennials that we were just talking about, because they are so big and they are going to form a lot of households. And as Lynn said, I think there's going to be plenty of rental demand and homeowner demand from that group. I think you get in trouble if you try to peg them, because they are the most diverse generation that we've had in this country, and so there is no millennial. There's a lot of different types of millennials. But back to the Gen X generation, we call them out in this report because that's really a group that is, because they're smaller, they haven't been gotten as much attention. And that's part of the headwind the housing market has faced, is the fact that we have many fewer people between, say, 35 and 54 right now, which is really the period of time when you're most active in the housing market. And then you factor in that this group is also one that saw their homeownership rates fall off the most from where they were in 1993. That group is really one that's struggling. They're more likely to have gone through a foreclosure, more likely to have that kind of blemish on their credit report. And to the extent that that group wants to get back in the housing market, I think we need to figure out a path for them to the extent, again, that they want to and can, because that group is both important to the housing market, and also they're a phase of life where trying to get that housing stability. It will be important for them.
I want to take a question.
Yeah, I had a quick question about how foreign investors have been impacting the housing market, especially in cities like New York. I know as a millennial in New York, it's a big concern for me because I can't afford to live in Manhattan, and I see a lot of the new construction being luxury buildings, not even really targeted to New Yorkers.
Yeah, a lot of foreign investment in the housing market in New York, in Manhattan, in Brooklyn. What kind of impact is that having?
It's having it depends on who you are. If you're an owner of the building, then it's having a great impact. If you're a millennial renter seeking a place to live, it has a terrible impact. There's an exceptionally great New York Times series called Towers of Secrecy that came out, I think, last year about this very phenomenon, foreign investors coming in, buying up lots of apartments in different buildings. And to the extent that we have these iconic skyscrapers that are going up in New York City that might be half or 75% owned by foreign investors. And so it's a really out of control phenomenon where you have these units sitting empty while lots of people are looking for housing just to find a place to put their head down at night.
Is that as much? Is that a factor in places other than New York, though? Are we seeing a lot of foreign money coming in to invest in U.S. real estate?
I think we're seeing, and I'm not an expert on this particular point, but anecdotally, we're seeing Chinese investors, for example, investing in some markets more on the West Coast. We've recently been in Detroit, and there are some foreign investors coming in, outside investors coming into that city. There's always going to be a market for speculation. I think we have unprecedented levels because of the unequal times, the inequality that we're seeing in various societies right now, and people looking to invest their money.
If I could put a slight, silver lining on that cloud, and it is a cloud. It does represent, though, people's expectation about growth in the U.S. versus other places in the world, right? It's very hard, and it's hard to think about housing markets and recognize the fact that the rest of the world really impacts our mortgage markets, right, our interest rates, and our housing market, but it does say something about where people want to invest. Yeah. So we can take a little cred for that.
Yes, yes.
Time for Just one other silver lining, and
Sure,
I'm aware
sure.
of a development in a tougher part of the town of Kansas City that's being financed for foreign investors under a little used piece of our immigration code, that if you invest a certain amount of money in this country, you can establish residency in this country. And so that's a Asian Americans for Equality, which is a New York-based nonprofit, is doing a redevelopment of warehouse district and with residential and commercial in Kansas City. It's revitalizing the neighborhood with foreign investors' money.
Yeah, yeah. I guess we're talking about different. I think the New York Times piece, the series, which was very good, I like that, was saying that there are these wonderful buildings going up in Manhattan that are sitting empty most of the time because they're owned by foreign investors who just want to have a pied-à-terre in Manhattan. Which is, I guess, a different thing from investing, from foreign investing, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay. If we have any other questions from the, sure.
So, given the growth in single-family rentals, and we know that, especially for affordable rentals, the vast majority are single-family, and the changes that have happened in that market, both in terms of the number of single-family rentals that are out there and the types of investors that are buying them. It's not something we've talked a lot about on this panel, but maybe not something we have a ready infrastructure to deal with. Can you all, particularly Paul and Chris, talk a little bit about where you think that market's going and what kind of things we need to be looking forward to?
You know, we've always had a lot of single-family homes in the rental market, so it's not like it's a new phenomenon. Certainly, this larger institutional presence is new, and the fact that it's gone from about 31% to 35% of rentals are single-family homes is a tremendous increase in a short amount of time. You know, I think there's good news, bad news there, and for the most part, I think it's probably good news, and I think that the absorption of that housing during a period of time when the housing market was troubled helped to stabilize a lot of communities. I think it's also potentially creating new opportunities for rental for people who might want to have a single-family home before, felt that the way to get into that was through home ownership, but for other reasons maybe they don't want to be there for that long, and those transaction costs and that risk were not something they want to take on. To the extent that there is a professionally managed asset class that might be more attractive to people, it could be a good thing. I think there's a lot of concerns about the nature of that investment interest and what effect it'll have on neighborhoods. I think that's an open question that we need to see. I think it depends on the strategy for those firms. If they have an exit strategy that's too abrupt, that might have a damaging effect. But I think that if they have a long-term interest in maintaining that asset, then there's no reason why they can't be good neighbors as well. But lots of open questions. The California Community Reinvestment Coalition came out with a report with a number of questions I think we need to pay attention to. But issues will have to do with management. Can you manage the diverse portfolio? And I'll let Paul talk to that, because I think there's reason to believe that you can, but that is a question that people are going to face.
Yeah, I join Chris with all the concerns that we've had about the entrance of the for-profit owners into it, but there's some ambivalence. It's bringing professional management to an inventory that was managed by mom and pops, onesie and twosies, which isn't very efficient, and also sometimes led to the fact that rental housing wasn't accepted in a lot of neighborhoods as a result. My biggest hope over this time, and we haven't made as much progress, was that the nonprofit sector would enter into the rental management to have longer term stewardship of the rental housing, to management consistent with both the resident and the community values and stability. But it's a challenging model. The scattered site rental housing is much more expensive to manage. We were talking earlier about the heterogeneity of the single-family stock in America. Each one is going to have a different toilet, a different boiler, a different carpeting. But over time, if you accumulated a sizable portfolio, you could start to standardize and create an efficient business model, as some of the folks Chris was talking about are showing. You can create efficient management business models. And my final comment on this is that I still remain bullish on that vision, in that we did a lot of work in my previous job with international organizations, especially in the UK, that do have huge portfolios of single-family scattered site rental, and they have very sophisticated business models. They're providing a terrific product that's affordable to working-class people in the UK, and there's a lot we can learn from what they've learned in how to manage this stock.
Okay, we've been talking about the release of the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies 2015 State of the Nation's Housing Report. I'd like to thank you all for participating. This has been great. We have heard from Chris Herbert, the Managing Director of the Joint Center, Paul Weech, President and CEO of NeighborWorks America, Celia Smoot, the Director of Housing for the Local Initiative Support Corporation, Lynn Fisher, Vice President of Research and Economics at the Mortgage Bankers Association, and a proud Penn State graduate, and Don Chen, Director of Metropolitan Opportunity here at the Ford Foundation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.